Hello, my name is Sam Scrovan, and I did my research on climate activism, predictors, and perceptions. Little introduction. It's no secret that climate change is an issue. Climate change has led to rising global temperatures, extreme weather events, rising sea levels, disruption and destruction of ecosystems, food and water insecurity, among many other things. Also, it disproportionately preys on impoverished and insecure countries. Climate distress. Climate distress is identified as anxiety, dissatisfaction, disillusionment, or mental distress as a result of climate change and the aforementioned effects. This can lead to mental health issues, including depression and anxiety. The roots of climate distress are not easily identifiable. It is often mischaracterized or misdiagnosed. Climate activism. Climate activism is identified as groups, individuals, ideas, or initiatives that are done with the objective of spreading awareness about or mitigating the aforementioned effects of climate change. Climate activism is theorized to grow semi-proportionately with climate change. So, as climate change grows, so should climate activism. They are reactionary in that way. Why I care. First, on the moral side. I believe that we as Americans owe the third world countries and impoverished communities a great ecological debt for what our practices and our practices have led them to experience. Also, I'm a climate activist. I'm a leader of my school's climate activist group, so I have a vested interest in understanding how to connect with others. Relevant literature. My first piece comes from Caroline Hickman. It identifies climate distress. In Climate Anxiety in Children and Young People and Their Beliefs About Government Responses to Climate Change, a global survey, the key takeaway is that young people are more likely to experience depression or anxiety directly as a result of climate change. So remember when I said that it is often mischaracterized or misdiagnosed? That's a lot less common in young people, mainly because they've grown up in a society where climate change is talked about a lot, along with many other mental health issues like anxiety or depression. So young people aren't necessarily a lot more prone to experience these things, but they're a lot more prone to be identified within these things. My second piece, How Climate Distress Leads to Climate Activism, I got from Judy Wu in Climate Anxiety in Young People, a Call to Action. Young people who experience climate anxiety and distress are more likely to become involved in climate activism. So climate anxiety, climate distress, is a major identifier for climate activism. So there's very much a cause and effect relationship between these two things, theoretically. This is where the crossroads of these two things kind of occurs. But in my third piece, the barriers to these crossroads are identified. In Perceived Barriers to Climate Change Activism Behaviors in the United States, among individuals highly concerned about climate change by Carl Latkin, the key takeaway is that many people experience climate distress, but do not become involved in climate activism due to these perceived barriers. These main barriers being that they haven't been trained, that they do not know where to start, that others can do more, that they don't want to harm others, and that they're just too busy. So the gap. There's a lack of research and understanding of what leads certain young people to see climate change as an issue, experience climate distress, but not partake in climate activism. So that, to fill in that gap, I asked the question, how and why is there resistance to climate activism among young adults who acknowledge climate change as an issue? So my key demographic in this research are people who experience climate distress and might want to become involved in climate activism as per Judy Wu's research, but they just don't for whatever reason, and I want to understand why they don't. My method. I start by distributing a semi-structured questionnaire, a combination of multiple choice, Likert, and short answer questions. I intend to get about 10% of my school population to answer, and I'm distributing this survey anonymously to as many people as I can. So 130 is my number, but if I got more, fantastic, and if I get less, I'll have to deal with it. I drew this from Ms. Caroline Hickman's Climate Anxiety in Children and Young People for the ability to understand the nuance of structured questions and ideas through open-ended questions. So these structured questions and the Likert questions are going to be able to identify quick responses or demographics, but the open-ended short answer questions are gonna really allow me to understand the nuance, because I don't really expect to get a lot from just the multiple choice questions. Then I have a two-part analysis. The first part, my own addition, is our open source code to find correlations quantitatively. I don't really expect to find a lot from this. I'll tell you why in a second, but I do expect to find a lot from my second pass, which is an interpretive analysis of responses and patterns to identify nuance or make explanations. This was largely taken from Carl Latkin's research, and analysis and conclusions that will be drawn are expected to align with his. Those perceived barriers that I mentioned earlier, the too busy or they don't know where to start. I expect those to transfer over. Here are my results for the quantitative analysis. All questions and responses were consolidated into a spreadsheet once I got the survey out. I got around 90 responses. I had to scrap a few, so the average number of responses per question was about 87. Not where I wanted to be, but I could work with it. The spreadsheet was then loaded into R, and each question and section of responses were grouped into specific variables. Each variable was then assigned a point value. Then I used Pearson's correlation coefficient to compare the variables to one another. And what I found was not really surprising. I found that there was no statistically significant correlation among any of the variables at all. But then I found a lot more in my interpretive analysis. I'm gonna kind of explain this in a chronological way, kind of how I interpreted the students might be taking the survey and what their mind might be going through as they're taking it. The first, how concerned are you about the effects of climate change? As you can see, a majority of the respondents are not very concerned about climate change or its effects. I was a little bit surprised by this, but also not really. But as per Carl Latkin's research, most respondents should then not have a vested interest in climate activism because it is very much reactionary. So if they care about climate change, they are more likely to get involved in climate activism. But then, in the short answer question that directly corresponded with that question, which was optional, 80 people responded. 80 of my around 90 people responded to this optional question asking how they are or aren't concerned. And overwhelmingly, they responded in ways that show that they might actually be concerned about climate change. A lot of them identified global warming as a big concern, air quality, irreversible changes, and one key thing I saw among a lot of responses is that they're not concerned right now, but they see themselves as being concerned maybe in the future. So then I went to climate activism questions. And there's overwhelmingly little perceived exposure to climate activism. The key word here is perceived. Most people identify in the moderates or the not at alls in the questions about the products of climate activism in their day-to-day lives. But again, the short answer questions greatly differed with these questions. 57 of the 87 respondents identified and described different forms of climate activism that they have been exposed to firsthand. So in the question, if you have been exposed to climate activism, please describe the groups, initiatives, and or movements. People were able to name directly things that they have experienced in their day-to-day lives that could be defined as climate activism. So here I'm kind of thinking that the respondents don't really identify certain things, because a lot of them said, I sometimes see this at my school, or I sometimes come across people asking me to sign something at a grocery store. That's climate activism, but they weren't able to identify that as climate activism in the multiple choice question. So then in the multiple choice question, asking them what they have been exposed to, 65 people responded. Over half of them before said that they have never been exposed to climate activism. But now we see that 65 of them are able to identify things that are climate activism, that are defined as climate activism. So there's a very big inconsistency between these two things. And then when I asked them to rate their perception of this climate activism, I wasn't really surprised. I thought that a lot of them had a very low perception or a moderate perception of climate activism, and this stood true. And the short answer questions aligned with this a lot. So as opposed to the other ones where the short answer questions greatly differed from the multiple choice, this one, both of them were very, very similar. people said things like climate activism is ineffective and or annoying. This is why I think my quantitative analysis didn't really work out, because of these inconsistencies among the short answer questions and the multiple choice questions, people's inconsistent perceptions of their own thoughts and ideas. So the question about the perceived barriers to becoming involved in climate activism were very, very similar to Carl Lackman's research. 1, they're too busy. This was the most common. 2, they just don't see the effects of climate change. 3, they do not know where to start. 4, others can do better. 5, they don't care. But the key with that they don't care is that they don't care now. A lot of them said that they do care for the future, but they just don't care about the present. As you can see, 89% of the students said that they've never taken part in any form of climate activism. This, again, was not surprising. My conclusions. The short answer and multiple choice questions often greatly differ. For example, in multiple choice questions, most participants do not see climate change as an issue, but in the short response ones, they identify many issues that they see with climate change. This analysis was based off of Hickman's research. Then that there are 3 main barriers among respondents. I've looked at all the open-ended questions about the barrier, and I kind of picked out a bunch of different themes, and the 3 main themes were that they are too busy with their day-to-day lives, they don't think that they can make an impact, and they do not see climate change firsthand in the present. This analysis and my groupings were based off of Lackman's research. My quantitative analysis did not yield many results. This pointed towards the fact that there is no statistical correlation between one's concern about climate change and perceptions of climate activism. My interpretive analysis showed me something else. It showed me that young people are not easily able to identify within specific groups or grouped perceptions regarding climate change. I think that this is because of the lack of education and awareness about things like climate distress and climate anxiety. People experience these things and they're able to describe these things, but they don't have a noun that they can attach it to, like climate anxiety or climate distress. That's why in the questions where things were given to them, like the multiple choice questions, they identified the moderates or the not at alls. But when they were able to be creative about their emotions and describe things, they showed that they actually do experience these things very much so. Back to the main question. This question, of course, I'll remind you, is how and why is there resistance to climate activism among young adults who acknowledge climate change as an issue? There's no significant connections that can be made between a young person's climate distress and their involvement in climate activism. This isn't saying that there isn't an existing connection, but based on my research, I can't identify one. I think I'm very limited in my research. Climate distress is just too difficult to identify or understand in a survey like this. It's an incredibly nuanced and complicated thing, and I don't think a simple survey can answer this. Young people are not necessarily able to confidently identify or describe their own perceptions and emotional values. This goes for anything, especially climate distress. Young people change so much and they're so out of tune with their emotions that you can't really expect to draw correlations or conclusions off of things, especially if young people don't really understand themselves in the first place. That leads me to my implications and limitations. I think that there should be a change in structure and research regarding climate distress and perception. I think that it should no longer be surveys or even short answer questions. I think that professional statisticians could find correlations, and perceptions of climate change on either extreme are often misunderstood or misinterpreted. But in the future, I think this study might benefit from personal interviews, larger sample sizes, and follow-up questionnaires and interviews to the first interviews. And here are my sources.
Nicely done, Sam. So we have a few questions for you from the panel.
All right, starting us off here. So I know you mentioned a little bit about like your personal kind of stake in this, but how did your initial exploration of scholarly conversation lead you to your final research question or goal?
I think I was really surprised. I was I think I had really high expectations for what I would find, and that my answer would just be given to me really quickly. But my gap was so gaping that I think I was surprised that there wasn't a lot of research on the specific topic, especially pertaining to young people. And that, I think, really lit a lot more curiosity in me to find it, because it's something that I experience on a day-to-day basis.
Perfect. So here's a follow-up question. So, and you addressed this to some extent, but I want to give you another chance to talk about it. Your new understanding was surprising to you. To what extent do you think that was due to the limitations of your own study, the surprise you had in the results? And to what extent do you think it really just has to do with the reality that's out there?
I think it has more so to do with the reality, because I was very aware of my limitations when I started my study. I knew I wasn't gonna completely scratch my curiosity, completely scratch that itch, but so I knew that there would be gaps or things that I wouldn't be able to answer, but I wasn't really expecting to find no correlations, or to find that young people don't really understand themselves in the first place, and that climate distress and climate anxiety and climate activism are such complicated things that we might not even, the definition we have in 10 years might not be the definition that we have right now.
Terrific. And then as a final question, if you could revisit your whole process, and you talked a little bit about this in terms of future studies, but if you were starting this one all over again, what changes would you make, and how do you anticipate those would change your outcome?
I think I would start with, in addition, or the survey I had now, the questionnaire, would be my very first step to kind of identify the people that I might want to interview. And I think the main portion of my research would be interviews with people, and maybe even follow-up interviews, to really understand what they're thinking and how they're learning about climate distress and climate anxiety and climate activism. So I would really want to look at not just what people have experienced previously, but how they react to learning about these things.